2:15 in the morning. The Iraq-Iran border. A United States Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle sliced through the thin, freezing air at 28,000 feet. This was not a routine flight. Clamped to the belly of the fighter were two experimental munitions, known only as the Ghost variant. They were designed to destroy high-value electronics without leveling the buildings around them. Within 7 minutes, the crew would discover that these weapons were capable of something far more terrifying. The cockpit was a cramped world of glowing glass and focused intent. Captain Elias Thorne, call sign Scythe-11, adjusted his oxygen mask. The desert below was a vast ocean of black. Only the green-tinted glow of his multi-function displays provided a sense of reality. Behind him, his weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Sarah Miller, monitored the targeting pod. Scythe-11 spoke into the encrypted radio. Overlord, this is Scythe-11. We are 3 minutes from the release point. All systems are green. A voice crackled back from the Combined Air Operations Center in Qatar. Scythe-11, this is Overlord. You are cleared hot. The target is confirmed. No civilian activity detected within the perimeter. Execute. The target was a reinforced concrete facility nestled in a canyon 12 miles across the border. To the world, it was a research station. To intelligence analysts, it was the primary assembly point for the long-range drones currently destabilizing the region. This strike was meant to be a surgical removal. It was supposed to be a message that the United States could reach out and touch any target with absolute silence. 2:18 in the morning. Inside a darkened room in Al Udeid Air Base, Brigadier General Marcus Vance watched the live feed from a high-altitude drone. The drone circled 5 miles above the target, its infrared camera projecting a heat map of the facility. The general leaned forward. His hands were clasped behind his back. This mission had been authorized at the highest levels of the Pentagon. If it worked, the threat of drone swarms would be neutralized for months. If it failed, it was an act of war on sovereign soil. General Vance spoke to the technician beside him. Confirm the weapon telemetry is being recorded.
Yes, ma'am.
The technician responded. Sir, telemetry is active. The bombs are communicating with the satellite link. Everything is perfect. On the Strike Eagle, Lieutenant Miller tightened her grip on the hand controllers. She lined up the crosshairs on the facility's central cooling tower. The laser rangefinder began a rhythmic pulse. The numbers on her screen counted down. Miller spoke over the internal intercom. 10 seconds to release. Steering is centered. Laser is burning. Steady, Thorne replied. 2:20 in the morning. A heavy metallic clunk echoed through the airframe. The F-15E jumped upward. As the weight of the 2,000-pound munitions vanished from the pylons, the bombs deployed their wings and began a silent, gliding descent toward the coordinates. On the screen, the two white dots tracked toward the center of the crosshairs. There was no wind to buffet them. There was no air defense fire to stop them. The weapons were guided by a combination of GPS and inertial navigation. They were masterpieces of engineering. Each second brought them closer to the target. Miller watched the time-to-impact clock. It read 30 seconds, then 20, then 10. Impact in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 22 in the morning. On the infrared feed in Qatar, two massive blossoms of white heat erupted over the facility. The screen flared with the intensity of the detonation. For a moment, the building was obscured by a cloud of thermal energy. To every sensor in the United States military, the target had just been obliterated by a direct hit. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 2:23 in the morning. The thermal bloom on the high-altitude drone feed began to dissipate. General Vance stood motionless. In the Combined Air Operations Center, the usual chatter of analysts fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. As the white heat faded, the jagged edges of the canyon reappeared. Then, the facility came back into view. It was perfect. Not a single stone was out of place. The cooling tower that Miller had targeted with laser precision stood tall and undisturbed. The infrared signature of the building was cool. There was no fire. There was no smoke. There was no debris. Vance turned to his senior intelligence officer. Explain that. We just saw 2 tons of high explosive detonate on that roof. The officer tapped at his screen. Sir, the satellite confirmed detonation. The seismic sensors at the border recorded the shockwave. The weapons fired. They hit, but the target is untouched. 5 miles away and 20,000 feet higher, Scythe 1-1 banked the Strike Eagle into a wide circle. Lieutenant Miller stared at her tactical display. The targeting pod was still locked onto the coordinates. The image was crystal clear. Scythe 1-1. This is Overlord, the radio crackled. We are seeing 0 damage on the primary objective. Report your visual. Miller keyed her mic. Her voice was tight. Overlord, Scythe 1-1. My pod is showing a clean sight. I repeat, no damage, no impact craters. The facility is fully intact. I am checking weapon status. She quickly scrolled through the store's management system. The pylons were empty. The digital handshake between the aircraft and the bombs had been recorded as a successful release. The flight computer confirmed the weapons had impacted at the exact GPS coordinates. Everything says we hit it, Miller said to Thorne over the intercom, but I am looking right at it. It is like we never dropped a thing. Thorne glanced at his fuel state. Maybe they were duds, both of them. 2 experimental bombs failing the exact same way at the exact same time, Miller asked. That is not a malfunction. That is a miracle. 2:26 in the morning. Inside the facility, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and old dust. Major Arash, the commander of the drone assembly unit, stood in the center of the subterranean control room. Moments ago, the early warning radar had screamed. The Americans were coming. He had ordered his men to the bunkers. He had closed his eyes and waited for the ceiling to collapse. The sound had been like nothing he had ever heard. It was not a bang. It was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to pull the air out of his lungs. The lights had flickered but stayed on. The monitors had flared with static for 3 seconds and then returned to normal. One of his technicians looked up from a console. Major. The perimeter sensors reported a massive kinetic event on the roof. 500 kilograms of force. Twice. Arash walked to the reinforced door and pushed it open. He climbed the stairs to the surface level. He expected to find a ruin. He expected to find his men dead. Instead, he stepped out into the cool night air of the canyon. He looked up at the roof. It was pristine. The metal vents were still spinning slowly in the breeze. He looked at the ground. There were no fragments of American steel. There were no scorched patches of earth. Major, the technician called from the doorway. We have a secure line incoming from Tehran. They want a status report. Arash looked at the sky. He knew the Americans were still up there. He could feel the weight of their eyes through the clouds. He walked back into the control room and picked up the handset. This is Major Arash, he said. His voice was steady, but his heart was racing. Report to High Command. The Americans just attempted a strike on this facility. They failed. We have sustained 0 casualties and 0 damage. Tell them we are ready to proceed with the scheduled launch. 2:30 in the morning. Back in the American Operations Center, a communications officer pulled off his headset. He looked at General Vance with a face that had gone pale. Sir, the officer said, we just intercepted an unencrypted broadcast coming directly from the target facility. It is a status report. Vance did not take his eyes off the screen. And they are reporting a complete failure of our ordnance. They are mocking us, sir. And they just gave the order to bring their drone batteries to full combat readiness. The mission was no longer a surgical strike. It was now a countdown to an escalation that no one was prepared for. 2:31 in the morning. The Zagros Mountains. Inside the subterranean assembly hall, the air felt thick and heavy. Major Arash walked along the catwalk, looking down at the rows of Delta Wing drones. They were fueled and ready. He stopped at the edge of the railing and wiped sweat from his forehead. The sensation from minutes ago refused to leave his mind. It had not been an explosion. An explosion had a signature. It had heat and a sharp, cracking sound that shattered eardrums. This had been a deep, vibrating thrum. It had felt as if the entire mountain had been turned into a tuning fork. Every metal surface in the room had hummed for exactly 3 seconds. Then, silence. A technician ran up the metal stairs. He was holding a handheld sensor. Arash looked at the screen. Report. What did the sensors capture? The technician pointed to a jagged line on the display. The magnetic field inside the bunker spiked by 4,000% at the moment of the event. It was not a kinetic impact. It was a massive electromagnetic surge. But it did not fry our circuits. It just passed through us. Arash frowned. Are the drones operational? The technician nodded. Yes, sir. Every system is green.
Excellent.
The guidance computers are functional. The satellite links are active. Whatever the Americans dropped, it did not work. 2:33 in the morning. Arash reached the surface entrance again. He looked at the roof of the facility. The moonlight revealed the smooth, gray concrete. There was not a single crack. There was no smell of burnt cordite or high explosives. He walked to the center of the rooftop, where the coordinates for the strike had been centered. He knelt and touched the ground. The concrete was cold. If 2 1,000-pound bombs had hit this spot, there should be a hole 40 feet wide. There should be twisted rebar and fire. Instead, there was nothing. It was as if the weapons had simply ceased to exist. The moment they touched the atmosphere above the building, the major stood up and spoke into his radio. Command, this is Arash. Confirm my last. The American strike was a total failure. I am standing on the point of impact. There is no damage. I repeat, 0 damage. A cold, mechanical voice responded from the regional headquarters in Kermanshah. Major, we have received your report. Tehran has been briefed. They do not believe it was a failure. They believe it was a provocation. They believe the Americans are testing a new form of psychological warfare, a show of precision without the cost of blood. Arash looked toward the western horizon. He knew the F-15E was still out there, circling in the dark. What are our orders? Tehran has authorized a response, the voice replied. We are to begin the launch sequence for the first wave of drones. If the Americans want to play with shadows, we will give them fire. You have 5 minutes to achieve launch readiness. 2:35 in the morning. Deep inside the mountain, the heavy steel doors of the launch tubes began to grind open. The hydraulic hiss echoed through the canyon. On the radar screens in the American Operations Center, the signatures of the facility began to shift. The heat profiles of the drone engines were blooming. Major Arash watched the first drone slide into its launch position. He felt a sense of professional pride, but underneath it, a growing dread. He did not understand what had happened on his roof. He did not understand why the air still felt wrong. It felt as if the world was slightly out of focus. He tapped the side of his helmet. The static was still there. A low, rhythmic pulsing that sat just at the edge of his hearing. It sounded like a heartbeat. It was not coming from his radio. It was coming from the air itself. The first drone engine roared to life. The countdown began. 2:36 in the morning. Combined Air Operations Center, Qatar. General Vance stood in front of the primary tactical display. His shadow stretched long across the polished floor. The blue light of the screens reflected in his eyes. On the main feed, the foreign military facility remained a perfect, unmoving shape of gray concrete. But the telemetry told a different story. Sir, thermal signatures are spiking, an analyst called out. We have heat blooms from the launch tubes. They are prepping for a mass departure. Vance did not move. Explain the ordnance failure. Those weapons were guided by 2 independent satellite constellations. They had a laser basket. They hit the center of the roof. Where did the energy go? The lead weapons engineer typed furiously at his station. General,
Look at this.
the seismic data is the problem. It shows a massive kinetic release at the moment of impact. But the atmospheric sensors show 0 overpressure. No blast wave, no heat. It is as if the energy was displaced. It did not hit the building. It went somewhere else. Vance turned toward the engineer. Where else? We do not know, sir. It is physically impossible. 2:40 in the morning. The laws of thermodynamics do not allow for a 1,000-pound detonation to simply vanish. High above the canyon, Captain Thorne held the jet fighter aircraft in a steady orbit. His hands were light on the controls. He was a veteran of 3 combat tours. He had seen missiles miss. He had seen bombs fail to detonate. He had never seen a target simply ignore a direct hit. Scythe 1-1. This is Overlord, the radio crackled. Be advised, we are seeing launch activity at the objective. The target has gone to a red alert status. We are authorized for a second pass. Thorne adjusted his grip. Copy, Overlord. Do we have the same loadout? Negative, Scythe. You are to use your remaining conventional ordnance. 2 GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions. These are not experimental. Do you confirm? Confirm, Thorne said. 2 conventional munitions. We are turning into the wind now. In the back seat, Lieutenant Miller began the targeting sequence. She felt a cold knot in her stomach. The first strike had been silent and clean. A second strike with conventional explosives would be loud. It would be a declaration of war that no one could walk back. She spoke over the intercom. Thorne, my screens are acting up. I have a rhythmic interference on the radar altimeter. I see it too, Thorne replied. It is a pulse, every 3 seconds. It is coming from the ground, 2:45 in the morning. Back at the foreign military facility, Major Arash stood by the control console. The first drone was locked onto the rail. The engine was screaming. A high-pitched whine that filled the bunker. The technician looked at him, waiting for the final command. Major, the technician shouted over the noise. The Americans are turning back. Arash looked at the monitor showing the sky. They are frustrated. They do not understand why we are still standing. Launch the first wave. We must show them that their magic does not work. The technician pressed the button. The hydraulic piston fired with a thunderous crack. The Delta Wing drone surged forward, its small jet engine pushing it toward the canyon opening. But the drone did not fly. As it reached the exit, the drone seemed to hit an invisible wall. The nose crumpled, as if it had struck solid steel. The wings sheared off. The fuel tank ruptured, but there was no fire. The wreckage simply fell to the floor of the canyon. It did not tumble. It dropped like a stone in a vacuum. Arash stared at the screen. What was that? Did it hit a cable? No, sir, the technician whispered. The sensors. The sensors say the air at the mouth of the canyon is no longer air. It is as dense as lead. Outside, the second drone ignited its engine. The countdown continued. The machines did not know that the world had stopped making sense. 2:46 in the morning. The canyon floor. The wreckage of the first drone sat in the dust. It looked like a crushed soda can. Major Arash watched through the monitors as the second drone ignited its engine. The machine moved down the launch rail with a high-pitched scream. It reached the mouth of the canyon and stopped. It did not hit a physical object. There was no flash of light. The drone simply decelerated from 200 knots to 0. In less than a second, it hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then it fell straight down. The fuel did not ignite. The sparks from the metal hitting the rocks did not catch. The technician looked at Arash. His voice was trembling. Major, the air density at the exit is 10 times the normal limit. It is like the air turned into lead. The engine cannot push through it. The oxygen cannot burn. Arash felt a chill. He looked at the roof of the facility. This is not a weapon. This is a cage. They have locked us inside the mountain. 2:54 in the morning. Kermanshah Air Defense Sector. The Iranian commander of the Western Sector did not see a cage. He saw a failed American strike. He saw a blatant violation of his airspace. On his tactical screens, he saw the American F-15E turning for a second pass. He also saw the support aircraft. 300 miles away, a U.S. Air Force KC-135 tanker flew a steady orbit. It was the lifeline for the fighters. The commander spoke into the secure command net. Bring the long-range missile batteries to full power. We will not target the fighter. Target the tanker. If they want to test our resolve with these games, we will show them the cost of their failure. Lock on and hold. Across western Iran, heavy missile canisters rose into the firing position. Large radar dishes began to sweep the sky. They ignored the Strike Eagle for now. They went for the vulnerable heart of the American operation. 3 o'clock in the morning. Captain Thorne felt the vibration in his teeth. It was no longer just a sound. It was a physical pressure. The F-15E was 5 miles from the release point. The cockpit glass was humming so loudly, it drowned out the sound of the engines. Lieutenant Miller spoke over the intercom. "Thorne, the radar is gone. It is not being jammed. It is just empty. I have 0 returns from the ground. I cannot see the canyon on the screen. I cannot see the building." Thorne looked out the canopy. The moon was bright. He could see the mountains with his own eyes. He could see the jagged lines of the desert. But on his digital displays, there was only a flat, gray void. The sensors were telling him the world below had vanished. "I am flying on visual," Thorne said. "I am not turning back. We have to finish this. We have to know what is down there." His hands were shaking on the stick. It was not from fear. The flight controls were vibrating at a frequency that felt like it was trying to shake the aircraft apart. The air around the canopy began to shimmer. It was a faint, purple glow. It looked like the Northern Lights, but it was centered directly over the Iranian facility. In the back seat, Miller checked her defensive systems. "Thorne, we have a problem. I am detecting multiple high-power radar locks. They are not on us. The Iranians are painting the tankers in the rear. They are prepping for a mass launch." The mission was no longer a surgical strike. It was a descent into an impossible space that was dragging the entire region toward a cliff. 3:01 in the morning. The Iranian commander at Kermanshah gave the order. Launch. 4 long-range missiles ignited. They climbed into the night on pillars of orange flame. They were not tracking the fighter. They were locked onto the American tanker 300 miles away. The Iranian strategy was clear. If they destroyed the fuel, the American fighters would fall into the desert. Call sign Guardian 1. The missile warning system screamed. A continuous, high-pitched tone filled the cabin. The pilot banked the heavy aircraft into a desperate turn. He released clouds of chaff and flares. It was not enough. The incoming missiles were faster. They were smarter. 3:02 in the morning. Captain Thorne felt the F-15E lurch. The aircraft had hit the wall of lead-dense air. The airspeed indicator dropped from 500 knots to 200 in 3 seconds. The engines roared as the computer fought to stay in the sky. The purple glow outside was now blinding. It was no longer a shimmer. It was a solid dome of light. Thorne shouted over the intercom. "Miller, I cannot hold it. The controls are locking up." Miller did not answer immediately. She was staring at her display. The screen was no longer showing radar or infrared. It was showing a geometric pattern of white lines. It looked like a map, but it was not a map of the Earth. "Thorne, release the weapons," Miller said. Her voice was flat. "Release them now." 3:03 in the morning. In the operations center in Qatar, General Vance watched the disaster unfold. On the main screen, 4 red dots were seconds away from the American tanker. On the tactical feed, the F-15E was vibrating so violently the telemetry was breaking up. "Sir," the analyst yelled, "the Iranian missiles are 10 seconds from impact." Vance gripped the edge of the table. "Order the tanker to punch out. Tell Scythe 1-1 to abort." "It is too late, sir," the analyst replied. "They are in the zone." 3:04 in the morning. Inside the Iranian facility, Major Arash stood under the purple light. The ceiling of the bunker was translucent. He could see the American fighter through the solid concrete. He could see the 2 bombs falling from its wings. He could see the missiles in the far distance, closing in on their targets. He felt a sudden, profound sense of peace. The heartbeat sound had stopped. The air was perfectly still. He realized he was no longer breathing. He did not need to. 3:05 in the morning. Thorne pressed the release button. The two conventional bombs fell away. They entered the purple dome. They did not fall toward the building. They began to orbit the center of the light. At the same moment, the 4 Iranian missiles reached the American tanker. They were less than 500 meters from the wing. The warheads were armed. The proximity fuses were active. The entire region was 1 second away from a total war. 3:0 to 6 in the morning. The 4 Iranian missiles did not detonate. They did not miss. They simply ceased forward motion. At the American tanker, the pilot looked out his side window. A long-range missile sat motionless 300 meters from his wing. It was suspended in the air like a specimen in a glass jar. The orange flame from its engine was frozen in time. It looked like a jagged sculpture of light. The pilot reached for his radio, but there was no static. There was no noise. There was only the sound of his own breathing. "Overlord," the pilot whispered. "The threats have stopped. Everything has stopped." 3:0 to 6 in the morning. In the operations center in Qatar, the main tactical display changed. The blue and red icons of the opposing forces vanished. In their place, thousands of white dots began to bloom across the map. They were not clustered over the border. They were appearing over every major city on the planet. London, Washington, Beijing, Tehran. General Vance stared at the screen. "Is this a hack? Is the system compromised?" The lead analyst shook his head. "No, sir. This is coming from the satellite backbone. These are physical contacts. They are appearing at 80,000 feet. They are descending at 10,000 knots, and they are all stopping at exactly 3,000 meters above the ground." "Whose are they?" Vance asked. The analyst looked up. His face was devoid of color. "Sir, they do not have a radar signature. They are not reflecting our energy. They are absorbing it. We only see them because they want us to." 3:0 to 6 in the morning. Inside the F-15E, Captain Thorne felt the engines die. The roar of the twin turbofans vanished. The cockpit lights went dark. The aircraft should have stalled. It should have tumbled toward the desert. Instead, the military aircraft remained perfectly level. It glided forward at a walking pace. Thorne looked at his hands. They were glowing with a faint, white light. He looked at his crewmate. She was frozen, not with fear, but as if the world had been paused. He looked down at the canyon. The purple dome was gone. The facility was gone. In its place was a circle of black glass a mile wide. The two conventional bombs were hovering above the glass. They were rotating slowly, as if being inspected by an invisible hand. 3:0 to 6 in the morning. Major Arash stood on the black glass. He was no longer in the bunker. He was not in the control room. He was standing in the center of the canyon. Around him, his technicians and soldiers stood in a circle. They were looking at the sky. The sky was no longer black. It was filled with thousands of white spheres. They were silent. They did not move. They hung in the air like stars. Arash looked at the military fighter jet hovering 100 feet above him. He could see the pilot. He could see the wing. He felt no anger. He felt no urge to fight. He felt a sudden, crushing realization that the war they had been about to start was like two ants fighting over a crumb while a giant walked past. A voice did not speak, but a thought entered his mind. It was a single word. It was repeated in every language on the planet at the exact same moment. Enough. The black glass began to pulse with a low, deep rhythm. It was the heartbeat again, but it was no longer coming from the ground. It was coming from everywhere. The air, the water, the metal of the ships, the very bones of the people watching the sky. The pivot had occurred. The two most powerful militaries in the region were no longer the primary actors. They were spectators. The morning was no longer quiet. It was filled with a sound that felt like the beginning of the world. 3:10 in the morning. The Iraq-Iran border. The suspension of physics did not end with a bang. It ended with a soft, collective exhale of the atmosphere. In a single heartbeat, the frozen Iranian missiles resumed their flight, but their trajectory had changed. They did not strike the American tanker. They tumbled harmlessly into the Persian Gulf, their warheads rendered inert. The jet engines of the Strike Eagle roared back to life, the sudden surge of power pushing Captain Thorne back into his seat. Thorne grabbed the stick. his eyes darting to the instrument panel. The glass displays flickered and then stabilized. The geometric patterns were gone. The standard tactical map returned, but it was useless. Every radar warning receiver on the aircraft was lit up. The sky was saturated with contacts that the computer could not classify. Scythe 1-1. Overlord. Do you read? The voice from Qatar was distorted, shaking with a frequency Thorne had never heard. Overlord. Scythe 1-1. I have control. Thorne shouted. Status of the tanker. Status of the threats. Guardian 1 is safe, the controller replied. The missiles fell into the water. But Scythe, look at your vertical. Look up. Thorne craned his neck. Above the jet fighter aircraft, the white spheres were beginning to move. They did not fly like aircraft. They drifted with a fluid, organic grace, forming a perfect grid that stretched from horizon to horizon. They were silent. They emitted no heat. They ignored the laws of inertia. 3:15 in the morning. In the operations center, General Vance watched the global feed. The thousands of white dots on the map were no longer descending. They were holding position at exactly 10,000 feet over every major military installation on Earth. Strategic military installations. The spheres were not attacking, they were loitering. The high-level commander was on the secure line. The foreign leadership was being briefed in a bunker beneath the foreign capital. For the first time in 80 years, the two nations were not looking at each other. They were looking at the same ceiling. General, a technical sergeant called out, I have a signal. It is a broadcast originating from the site of the strike. It is being transmitted on every military frequency simultaneously. Vance adjusted his headset. Play it. There was no voice. There was only a rhythmic pulse. It matched the heartbeat Thorne had felt in the cockpit. It was a code, but not one based on mathematics or language. It was a biological sequence. Analysts would later describe it as a digital map of human DNA. It was a reminder of what both sides were made of. 3:20 in the morning. Major Arash stood in the center of the black glass circle. The canyon was gone. The reinforced concrete facility, the drone assembly lines, and the launch rails had been erased. The ground beneath his boots was as smooth as a mirror and as hard as diamond. Arash reached down and touched the black surface. It was warm. It felt like living skin. He looked up and saw the military fighter circling low. He saw the pilot looking down at him. He unclipped his sidearm and dropped it onto the glass. It made a sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the silent canyon. One by one, his soldiers did the same. There was no order given. There was no surrender to the military forces. It was a surrender to a reality that made their weapons look like toys. 3:25 in the morning. The jet fighter aircraft began its departure from the area. Thorne was low on fuel, but he didn't care. He watched the white spheres through the canopy. They were beginning to fade. They were not leaving. They were becoming transparent, blending into the starlight until they were invisible to the naked eye. But on the radar, they remained. Thousands of solid, unmoving ghosts. Overlord, Thorne said. The objective is gone. There is nothing left to strike. Requesting vectors for the tanker. Copy. Scythe 1-1, the controller said. His voice was exhausted. Come home. The world is different now. We are all trying to figure out what comes next. The crisis had not ended. It had merely shifted into a second phase where the enemy was no longer human. 3:30 in the morning. The F-15E Strike Eagle banked toward the west. Its wingtips trailed thin ribbons of vapor in the cold night air. Behind the aircraft, the Zagros Mountains were a jagged silhouette against a sky that felt too empty. On the tactical displays, the white dots representing the spheres remained perfectly stationary. They did not flicker. They did not drift. They were a digital grid laid over the physical world. Lieutenant Miller checked the fuel state again. Thorne, we are at bingo fuel. The tanker is orbiting 20 miles ahead. If we do not plug in now, we are gliding into the sand. Thorne did not look at the fuel gauge. He was looking at the radar altimeter. It was reading 0. Even though they were at 22,000 feet, the sensor believed the ground was touching the belly of the jet. I have the tanker in sight, Thorne said. I am going to keep the master arm-on safe. I do not want any systems active that might look like a threat. Not to the foreign military. Not to whatever is up there. 3:45 in the morning. The heavy military refueling aircraft stabilized its flight. The refueling boom lowered from the tail like a long, searching finger. Thorne moved the Strike Eagle into position. The connection was made with a mechanical clunk. For the next 5 minutes, thousands of pounds of fuel flowed into the fighter. Inside the tanker, the boom operator stared through the glass at the F-15E. He could see the pilot clearly. He could also see the reflection in the fighter's canopy. In the glass, the stars were not points of light. They were perfect, glowing circles. The boom operator keyed his mic. Scythe 1-1. Do you see them on your visual? I see them, Thorne replied. Do they move when you look at them? No, the operator said. They just wait. It is like they are holding the sky up. 4 o'clock in the morning. In a secure bunker beneath the foreign capital, the foreign military high command sat in a circle. The room was silent. On the table lay a series of high-resolution photographs taken by a reconnaissance drone minutes ago. The images showed the canyon, where the drone facility had been. There was no fire. There was no rubble. There was only the perfect, circular sheet of black glass. The foreign military general of the Air Defense Force spoke first. We have confirmed with our technical teams. We did not fire the missiles at the tanker. The systems fired themselves, and then they were stopped. Across the table, a civilian advisor shook his head. The Americans are saying the same thing. They are claiming their weapons were redirected. They are opening a direct line of communication. They want to know if we are seeing the spheres over our cities. The general looked at the photographs. Tell them we see them. Tell them that for the first time in 1,000 years, the border does not matter. There is a new power in the sky, and it has no interest in our politics. 4:15 in the morning. Back at the Ghost impact site, the foreign military rescue helicopters arrived. The pilots hovered at the edge of the black glass. They refused to land on it. Major Arash and his men walked across the desert sand to meet them. They moved slowly. Their eyes were wide. Arash looked back one last time. The black glass was beginning to sink. It was not melting. It was descending into the earth as if the planet were absorbing a foreign object. Within minutes, the canyon floor returned to its original state. The rocks were back. The dust was back. But the facility was gone. It had not been destroyed. It had been removed. One of the soldiers grabbed Arash by the shoulder. Major, look at the sky. The spheres were gone. The radar screens at the regional headquarters went blank. The satellites reported a clear sky. The enough message echoed one last time in the back of Arash's mind, and then faded into a memory. The immediate crisis was over. The missiles had not flown. The war had not begun. But as the sun began to hint at the horizon, every person in the region knew the same truth. The world was no longer theirs alone. 4:30 in the morning. Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar. The wheels of the F-15E Strike Eagle chirped as they touched the tarmac. The heavy fighter slowed, its engines whistling in a low, exhausted tone. Captain Thorne steered the aircraft toward a hardened shelter where a swarm of ground crew and intelligence officers waited. There was no cheering. There were no high fives. The men on the ground moved with a grim, mechanical efficiency. They had seen the same satellite feeds as the generals. They knew that the mission had not ended in a victory or a defeat. It had ended in a question that none of them could answer. Thorne shut down the engines. The silence that followed was heavy. He pulled off his helmet and felt the cool desert night air on his damp hair. His hands were finally still. Lieutenant Miller climbed out of the back seat. She stood on the wing for a moment, looking at the stars. They are still there, Thorne. Even if we cannot see them on the radar anymore, they are still there. Thorne hopped down to the concrete. I know. I can still feel the vibration in my teeth. A blue sedan pulled up to the hangar. 2 officers in plain clothes stepped out. They did not ask for a debrief. They did not ask for the mission tapes. They simply gestured for the crew to follow them. The debriefing would not happen at the squadron level. It was going straight to the top. 5:15 in the morning. The Pentagon, Washington, District of Columbia. The Situation Room was crowded, but it was the quietest room in the city. General Vance sat at the end of the long table. On the wall-sized monitor, a split screen showed the coordinates of the Iranian facility and the center of the Persian Gulf. Both locations were empty. The black glass had vanished. The missiles were at the bottom of the ocean. A communications officer leaned over Vance's shoulder. "Sir, we have established a secondary secure link with Tehran. It is a non-military channel. They are confirming that all their drone batteries have been returned to a cold status. They have grounded their entire interceptor fleet for the next 48 hours. Vance nodded. "And our posture? We have moved to Defense Condition 3 as a precaution. But the Secretary has ordered a stand-down of all offensive operations in the sector. We are in a holding pattern." Vance looked at the images of the white spheres. They had been captured by a high-speed camera before they faded. They looked less like machines and more like holes in the sky. "They did not take sides," Vance said softly. "They did not protect the Iranians. They did not protect our tanker. They protected the timeline. They stopped a war that was 10 seconds away from burning down the hemisphere." The Director of National Intelligence sat across from him. "How do we report this to the public, Marcus? We cannot tell them the sky spoke to us. We tell them there was a technical malfunction on both sides," Vance replied. "We tell them that diplomatic channels were opened and the situation was de-escalated through professional restraint. We lie to them because the truth is that we are no longer the ones in control of our own backyard." 6 o'clock in the morning. The Zagros Mountains. Major Arash sat on the bumper of a transport truck. The sun was beginning to crest the peaks, painting the canyon in shades of deep orange and gold. The air was crisp and clean. There was no smell of smoke. There was no sound of jet engines. He watched as his men loaded the remaining equipment into the trucks. They worked in silence. The urgency of the previous night was gone. The hatred they had felt for the invisible Americans was gone. It had been replaced by a profound sense of humility. His radio crackled. It was the commander from Kermanshah. "Major, you are to evacuate the site and return to base. All records of the event are being classified under the highest state secret protocols. You did not see a light. You did not see the fighter. You did not hear the word." Arash looked at the ground where the facility had once stood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of stone. It was a fragment of the canyon wall that had survived the removal. He squeezed it in his hand until the sharp edges bit into his palm. "Understood," Arash said. "The site is clear. There is nothing left here." He climbed into the cab of the truck. As the convoy began to move, he looked up through the windshield. The sky was a perfect, empty blue. But he knew better. He knew that the world was being watched. He knew that the next time they reached for their triggers, the answer might not be a heartbeat. It might be something final. The crisis had resolved. The professional soldiers of two nations had stepped back from the edge, not because they wanted peace, but because they had been shown the futility of their war. 3 days later, 10:15 in the morning. The Pentagon. The conference room was windowless and chilled by high-capacity air conditioners. General Vance sat at the head of a table covered in physical folders. In the age of instant digital sharing, the most sensitive data had returned to paper. On the cover of each folder was a stamp that read, "Cosmic Top Secret." It was a classification that had not been used since the height of the Cold War. Across from him, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency opened a folder. It contained a single high-resolution still from the F-15E targeting pod. It showed the moment of the first impact. The two experimental bombs were visible, frozen in the air exactly 1 inch above the facility roof. They were glowing with the same purple light that had later engulfed the canyon. "The technical analysis is back from Los Alamos," the director said. His voice was hushed. "The Ghost variant munitions did exactly what they were designed to do. They generated a localized, high-frequency electromagnetic pulse. But something responded to that pulse. It was like a doorbell. We rang it, and something opened the door." Vance rubbed his eyes. "So the weapons didn't fail. They were intercepted." "Not intercepted, General. They were suspended." The physicists are calling it a temporal stasis field. For 3 minutes and 6 seconds, time inside that canyon did not move at the same rate as the world outside. That is why the bombs didn't explode. That is why the drones didn't fly. And that is why the Iranian missiles stopped in mid-air over the Gulf. 3 days later, 2:45 in the afternoon, Tehran. In a mirrored hall within the industrial complex of the Ministry of Defense, a group of scientists stood before a chalkboard. They were not looking at blueprints for drones. They were looking at a set of mathematical equations, derived from the static recorded by Major Arash's radio. It is a harmonic, the lead scientist explained, to a silent room of officials. The signal we intercepted is a series of prime numbers layered over a biological sequence. It is not a message for our government. It is a message for our species. It is a warning against the use of certain high-energy frequencies in a contested environment. An official in a dark suit stood up. Are you saying we cannot use our radar? Are you saying we are defenseless? I am saying that whenever we reach a certain threshold of aggression, the sky will intervene, the scientist replied. The Americans call it a technical malfunction. We call it a miracle of restraint. But the truth is that our battlefield has become a laboratory. We are no longer the ones conducting the experiment. 3 days later, 8 o'clock in the evening, a secure facility in Virginia, Captain Thorne and Lieutenant Miller sat in separate rooms. They had been through 72 hours of psychological screening and tactical debriefing. They had told the same story 40 times. Each time, the investigators had asked about the enough message. Thorne leaned back in his chair. The investigator across from him was a woman in her 50s with eyes that had seen everything. She didn't have a name tag. Tell me again, Captain, she said. Did you hear the word with your ears, or did you feel it in your mind? I felt it, Thorne said. It was like a memory of a voice I had known my whole life. It wasn't angry. It wasn't a threat. It was a correction, like a father stopping a fight between two children. The investigator nodded slowly. She closed her notebook. The Air Force is going to award you the Distinguished Flying Cross for your exceptional airmanship and restraint in a high-tension encounter. The official story is that you identified a catastrophic weapon malfunction and chose to bank away, preventing an accidental escalation. You are a hero of diplomacy, Captain. Thorne looked at the blank wall and the spheres, the black glass, the missiles that stopped in the air. What are they? They are a state secret, she replied. And for the sake of your career and the sanity of the public, they do not exist. Thorne knew she was lying. He could still feel the phantom heartbeat in his chest. He knew that every pilot in the sky, both American and Iranian, was now looking up more than they were looking forward. The strategic assessment was clear. The regional war had been averted, but the geopolitical landscape had been shattered. The two greatest rivals, in the Middle East, had been forced into a silent, terrified partnership. They were now united by a single, terrifying truth. The world was being managed. 1 month later, 10:15 in the morning, the National Air and Space Museum in Washington District of Columbia was crowded with tourists. Among them, a man in a civilian jacket and a baseball cap stood before the exhibit of an old Ford Phantom. He looked at the heavy rivets and steel construction of the vintage fighter. Captain Elias Thorne, no longer in flight status, felt a strange kinship with the antique machine. It belonged to a simpler time, a time when the sky was just air and the only thing a pilot had to fear was another pilot. Behind him, a voice spoke softly. It is strange to look at them now, is it not? Thorne turned. Standing a few feet away was a man he recognized from a blurry intelligence photo. He was older, his face lined with the stress of a life spent in the shadows of a foreign mountain range. It was Arash. He was no longer a major. He was a man in a suit, holding a guidebook like any other visitor. Thorne did not reach for a weapon. He did not call for security. In this place, surrounded by the history of human flight, the old animosities felt like echoes from a dream. They are relics, Thorne said. Even the jet fighter aircraft is a relic now. We just do not want to admit it yet. Arash nodded. He stepped closer to the railing. My government has closed the facility in the canyon. They have paved over the site with asphalt. They tell the people it was a landslide, but every night, the villagers look up. They are not looking for American planes. They are looking for the white stars that do not move. 1 month later, 2:45 in the afternoon, Tehran. In the hallways of the Iranian parliament, the rhetoric remained loud. There were speeches about sovereignty and the strength of the nation. But behind the closed doors of the defense committees, the tone was different. The budgets for long-range missiles were being quietly diverted into fundamental physics research. The race was no longer to build a better warhead. The race was to understand the ceiling that had been placed over the world. A senior strategist looked at a report on his desk. It summarized the events of the Ghost impact. The conclusion was written in a single, chilling sentence. Modern warfare is no longer a game between two players. It is a three-way match where the third player has the power to end the game whenever the stakes become too high. 1 month later, 8 o'clock in the evening, the Persian Gulf. A United States Navy destroyer cut through the dark water. On the bridge, the crew monitored their radar screens. They were professional, they were alert, but there was a new tension in the room. Whenever a contact appeared on the long-range sweep, the first question was no longer about its nationality. It was about its nature. The captain of the ship looked out at the horizon. The water was black and calm. The stars were bright. Somewhere out there, 1,000 meters below the surface, lay 4 foreign missiles and 2 American bombs. They were silent monuments to a war that never happened. They were evidence of a moment when the world was told to stop. Strategic analysts would later call this the age of the manager. It was a period where the great powers realized that their ultimate weapons were useless. If a strike was too precise, it was intercepted. If a conflict was too escalatory, it was paused. The human race had been put on a leash. The final thought of the official military report was never published. It was a note scrawled in the margin by General Vance before he retired. He wrote that humanity had spent thousands of years trying to master the earth and the sky. We had succeeded so well that we finally got the attention of the neighbors. And the neighbors were not impressed. The morning over the Gulf was quiet once more. But it was the quiet of a classroom, when the teacher is standing at the door. The world was still there. The people were still there. But the silence was different. Now, it was a silence that carried a weight. It was a silence that sounded like a single, whispered word. Enough.